Reflex action. Meaning. A reflex action is an automatic, involuntary response to a stimulus in the body that occurs without the involvement of conscious thought or decision-making. It is mediated by the reflex arc, which is a neural pathway that consists of sensory receptors, afferent neurons, interneurons, efferent neurons, and effectors. A reflex action occurs when a stimulus is detected by a sensory receptor, which sends a signal along an afferent neuron to the spinal cord. The signal is then processed by interneurons in the spinal cord, which in turn send a signal along an efferent neuron to an effector, such as a muscle or gland, which produces the response. Reflex actions are rapid and occur without the involvement of the brain, which allows for quick and automatic responses to potentially harmful stimuli. Examples of reflex actions include the knee-jerk reflex, sneezing, coughing, and the pupillary light reflex, among others. The reflex arc. The reflex arc is a neural pathway that mediates a reflex action in the body. It consists of several elements, including 1. Sensory receptor, a specialized cell or group of cells that detect a stimulus, such as a touch, heat, or pressure. 2. Afferent sensory neuron, a nerve cell that transmits the sensory signal from the receptor to the central nervous system CNS, such as the spinal cord or brain. 3. Interneuron, a nerve cell in the CNS that processes the incoming sensory signal and generates an outgoing signal to the efferent neuron. 4. Efferent, motor neuron, a nerve cell that transmits the outgoing motor signal from the CNS to the effector organ or muscle. 5. Effector, a muscle or gland that produces the response, such as muscle contractions or secretion of hormones. In a reflex arc, a stimulus is detected by a sensory receptor, which sends a signal along an afferent neuron to the spinal cord. The signal is then processed by interneurons in the spinal cord, which in turn send a signal along an efferent neuron to an effector, resulting in a rapid and automatic response to the stimulus, without conscious thought or decision-making. Sequence of a reflex action. The sequence of a reflex action involves several steps, including 1. Stimulus. A stimulus is detected by a sensory receptor in the body, such as a touch, heat, or pressure. 2. Sensory neuron activation. The sensory receptor activates a sensory neuron, which carries the signal from the receptor to the spinal cord. 3. Interneuron activation. The sensory neuron activates interneurons in the spinal cord. 4. Motor neuron activation. The interneurons activate motor neurons that carry the signal from the spinal cord to the effectors, the muscles or glands, in the body. 5. Response. The effectors respond to the signal by producing the appropriate response, such as muscle contraction or gland secretion. 6. Reflex arc completion. The reflex arc is completed, and the response occurs rapidly and automatically without conscious thought or decision-making. This sequence of events allows for rapid and automatic response to potentially harmful stimuli, before the brain has processed and interpreted the information. Overall, reflex actions serve to protect the body from harm and allow for quick and automatic responses to changes in the environment. Types of reflex actions. There are different types of reflex actions, including 1. Simple reflex action. This type of reflex action involves only one synapse in the spinal cord between the sensory and motor neurons, producing a simple response that involves the contraction of a specific muscle, such as the knee-jerk reflex. 2. Conditioned reflex action. This type of reflex action involves learning where a new stimulus is associated with a particular response, such as training an animal to respond to a bell by salivating. 3. Autonomic reflex action. This type of reflex action involves the involuntary response of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle and glands in the body, for example, the pupil's response to light. 4. Crossed extensor reflex action. This type of reflex action occurs when a painful stimulus causes a withdrawal response on one side of the body and a compensatory extension response on the opposite side. For example, if a nail enters the right foot, the left leg helps us stand up while the right leg is pulled back from the nail. Other types include the stretch or tendon reflex, withdrawal reflex, superficial reflex, etc. A simple reflex action. A simple reflex action is a basic and automatic response to a stimulus. It's a type of reflex action that involves only one synapse connection in the spinal cord between the sensory and motor neurons, producing a simple response that involves the contraction of specific muscles. It occurs very quickly, typically without conscious thought or decision-making. For example, the patellar reflex, knee-jerk reflex, is a simple reflex action that occurs when the tendon below the kneecap is tapped, which causes a brief stretch in the quadriceps muscles and results in the leg kicking out involuntarily. Other examples of simple reflex actions include the withdrawal reflex when we touch a hot object, and the pupillary light reflex in response to light. B. Conditioned reflex action. A conditioned reflex action is a learned response to a specific situation or stimulus that is not naturally associated with the response. It's a type of reflex action that involves training or conditioning an animal or person to respond to a particular stimulus by pairing it with another stimulus that already elicits a natural response. For example, if a bell is repeatedly rung before feeding a dog, the sound of the bell will become associated with food and will eventually elicit salivation even when no food is present. This is known as Pavlovian conditioning. Another example of conditioned reflex action is when someone sneezes when they smell a particular perfume, as they may have been conditioned to associate that perfume with allergies or hay fever. Conditioned reflex actions are a type of learned behavior that can be used to modify behavior in animals and people. They are important in the fields of psychology, behaviorism, and other related areas. Description of the cross-section of THR spinal cord, and the neuronic pathway. The spinal cord is a tube-like structure that runs down the back, protected by the vertebral column. It is made up of a bundle of nerve fibers, which transmit messages between the brain and the rest of the body. The cross-section of the spinal cord reveals a distinct butterfly-shaped region, which consists of gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is located in the center of the cord, and is arranged in a butterfly shape. It contains the cell bodies, dendrites and axon terminals of neurons, nerve cells. The white matter surrounds the gray matter, and is composed of myelinated nerve fibers, which are bundles of axons that transmit information up and down the spinal cord and to and from the brain. The neuronic pathway between sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons in the spinal cord is what comprises the reflex arc. It starts with a stimulus, which activates sensory receptors and sends impulses along sensory neurons to the spinal cord through the dorsal root, where interneurons process the information in the gray matter. This information then activates motor neurons in the anterior horn of the spinal cord's gray matter, which sends signals down through the ventral root and out to the muscles or glands, causing the reflex action. Overall, the juxtaposition of gray and white matter in a spinal cord cross-section enables the rapid processing and relay of sensory and motor information through the neuronic pathway from the stimulus to the appropriate response. Differences between simple reflex action and conditioned reflex action. The main differences between simple reflex action and conditioned reflex action are: 1. Nature of stimulus. Simple reflex actions are automatic, innate responses to a specific stimulus, while conditioned reflexes are learned responses that are acquired through experience and associations between stimuli. 2. Association with a response. Simple reflex actions involve an immediate and predictable response of the organism, predetermined by its anatomy, whereas conditioned reflex actions involve a learned response as the organism has been trained or conditioned to associate a specific stimulus with a particular response. 3. Neuronal pathway. Simple reflex actions generally involve only one or two synapses between sensory and motor neurons, while conditioned reflex actions involve a complex network of interneurons and multiple synapses. 4. Modifiability. Simple reflex actions are not directly modifiable by experience or learning, while conditioned reflex actions are modifiable and can be strengthened or diminished through further experience. 5. Type of response. Simple reflex actions involve a particular reflex response such as withdrawal or contraction, while conditioned reflex actions can include many responses ranging from physical responses to emotional and cognitive changes. In summary, while simple reflex actions are automatic responses to specific stimuli, conditioned reflex actions are learned and associated with specific stimuli that elicit a response through experience and training. Revision questions. 1. Define the following terms. A. Reflex action. B. Reflex arc. A. Reflex action. A reflex action is an automatic, involuntary response to a stimulus that occurs without conscious thought or decision. It is a rapid, pre-programmed response that does not involve the brain's conscious processing. B. Reflex arc. A reflex arc is a neural pathway that mediates a reflex action. It is the functional unit of the reflex, consisting of a sensory neuron, an interneuron in the spinal cord or other CNS structures, and a motor neuron. The reflex arc is responsible for processing the sensory input of the stimulus and responding with a motor output, often resulting in a protective or corrective response. 2. Outline the neuronic pathway of a reflex action. The neuronic pathway of a reflex action involves the following steps. 1. Reception of stimulus. The sensory receptors detect a stimulus, such as touching a hot stove. 2. Sensory neuron activation. The sensory neuron transmits the signal from the receptors to the spinal cord or brainstem. 3. Interneuron processing. In the spinal cord, an interneuron receives and processes the signal from the sensory neuron. 4. Motor neuron activation. The interneuron activates a motor neuron located in the spinal cord. 5. Muscle contraction or gland secretion. The motor neuron sends the signal to the target effector, which could be a muscle or gland, and causes it to respond to the stimulus with a reflex action. Overall, the reflex arc is a simple and rapid neuronal pathway that mediates a reflex action without the involvement of higher brain centers, resulting in an immediate and automatic response to a stimulus. 3. Give 3 examples of simple reflex action. 3 examples of simple reflex actions are: 1. The knee-jerk reflex. When the doctor taps the knee with a small hammer, the quadriceps muscle of the leg is suddenly stretched, causing an involuntary contraction of the muscle that kicks the lower leg out. 2. The withdrawal reflex. When a finger touches a hot stove or a sharp object, the sensory receptors in the skin detect the stimulus and transmit a signal through a sensory neuron to the spinal cord, which quickly activates a motor neuron to withdraw the hand from the source of pain. 3. The blink reflex. When an object moves quickly towards the eye, the cornea is stimulated, and the sensory neurons signal the brainstem, which activates a reflex response that causes eyelids to close rapidly, protecting the eye from potential harm. 4. What is the importance of conditioned reflex action in humans? Conditioned reflex action is an important form of learned behavior in humans. It can help us adapt to our environment and cope with changes in our surroundings. In a conditioned reflex action, an initially neutral stimulus, called a conditioned stimulus, is repeatedly paired with a naturally occurring stimulus, called an unconditioned stimulus, that evokes a reflex response. Eventually, the conditioned stimulus alone becomes sufficient to elicit the same reflex response, even in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. This type of learning is fundamental to many aspects of human behavior, including language acquisition, memory formation, and adaptive responses to changing circumstances. Some examples of conditioned reflexes in humans include salivation at the sight or smell of food, fear responses to certain stimuli, and conditioned emotional responses to specific events or situations. Overall, conditioned reflexes help us to learn and adapt to our environment, allowing us to modify our behavior according to changing circumstances and gain greater control over our responses to different stimuli.